He hadn't spoken in weeks. Chained, beaten, and left in a cage like some cursed creature. No one dared look him in the eye until a widowed woman walked through the crowd, pulled off her wedding ring, and said, "I'll take him." What followed wasn't rescue, it was rebirth. Stay with me, because this story doesn't end with freedom. It begins there. She hadn't meant to stop in Silverton. The mountain road had been unkind that morning, wind clawing at her bonnet like it wanted her scalp for a trophy. The wagon creaked with every mile, and the horse bless his ribs and his trembling knees looked ready to lie down and never rise again. But Nora Whitfield had kept going, because there was nothing behind her worth turning back for. Only a house too quiet, a war grave too full, and a silence that stretched like winter across her chest. So, when the wagon wheel gave out on the edge of that nowhere town, she stepped down, not with surprise, but with the resignation of a woman who had expected something to break. She gathered her skirts, adjusted her shawl, and looked around. Silverton greeted her with the sound of laughter that wasn't kind. Boys leaned against porch rails, spitting at dirt. A group of men in mining hats chuckled as they passed her busted wheel, offering no help, just comments about how she ought to hitch herself to the wagon next time. But Nora wasn't listening. She had already seen the cage. It stood in the town square like a monument to cruelty. Thick iron bars bolted to a wheeled platform, a sign nailed to the side in peeling paint, 5 cents to look, 10 cents to touch. A joke, a spectacle, a sentence. Inside was a man, or what was left of one. He was barefoot, shirt torn down one side, wrists bound in cuffs made of leather belts stitched together with rusted wire. His head was bowed hair falling over his face like the curtain in a funeral home. A child threw a rock. It clanged off the bars. The man didn't flinch. Nora moved closer before she realized she had done it. Like her feet weren't hers. Like something in her long sleeping had stirred at the sight of him. "What's he done?" she asked the sheriff, who was leaning against a post, whittling wood like it might someday pay him. He didn't look up. Who knows? Found him up near the pass, covered in blood, carrying another man's satchel. Wouldn't talk, wouldn't explain. So we figured if he wants to act like an animal, he can live like one. Is he dangerous to who? The sheriff gave her a long look. To a woman like you, only if you forget how to scream. That was when the man in the cage lifted his head. Not fully, just enough. His face was streaked with dirt and dried blood, eyes sunken but steady, not pleading, not rabid, just watching, like he was waiting for something that never came, like he'd already outlived every mercy, and was surprised to find one still breathing. Nora stepped forward until her boots met the base of the cage. The crowd grew quieter behind her. Does he have a name? Not one he's offered. Folks call him Ghost. Some say he's a killer. Others say he was born wrong and wandered out of the mountains half feral. She didn't answer. She couldn't. Her fingers twitched at her side, brushing the edge of her satchel. She hadn't pawned it. Not yet. Through the worst of it, through the empty nights, through the illness, through the telegram that read like a death knell, she had kept that small velvet pouch tucked in the corner of her pack. Her wedding ring. The only thing Thomas Whitfield left behind that hadn't faded, spoiled, or burned. She had told herself she'd die with it. But now there was a man in a cage who hadn't begged, hadn't fought, hadn't even spoken. And that silence said more than most men ever had. She reached into her bag, found the pouch by feel. The gold band inside was thin, worn soft at the edges from years of promises and nights spent clutching it in grief. She pulled it free and turned to the sheriff. "Will this buy him?" The sheriff raised his eyebrows. "That thing you'd do better trading spit for a mule. Ain't worth $10, but..." He took the ring anyway, held it to the light like it was a horse's tooth. then grinned. "It'll make for a damn good story." He shoved the ring in his pocket and unlocked the cage. The key turned with a metal shriek that startled the birds from the eaves. The man inside didn't move. The sheriff nodded toward Nora. "He's yours now. Hope you brought rope and regrets." She ignored the laughter that followed. She stood at the open door of the cage and looked in. "You can stay or come, but no one owns you now." For a moment, nothing happened. Then, like someone waking from deep water, the man slowly pushed himself up. Hands to knees, shoulders stiff, legs shaking from disuse. He stepped into the light. He was taller than she expected. Not young, not old, not clean, but not defeated either. A mountain man burned down to the last ember, but still glowing. He didn't speak, didn't thank her, but he followed. Nora climbed onto the wagon without another glance at the sheriff or the gawking crowd. The man climbed in back. The wheels groaned, the horse snorted, and they rolled away from Silverton like smoke drifting from a flame someone else had lit. The town shrank behind them. The pine trees opened ahead, and for the first time in a long time, Nora Whitfield didn't feel like she was running away. She felt like she had just begun. They traveled in silence, the kind that felt less like absence and more like permission. Ronan, though still wordless, had begun to move with a kind of rhythm beside Nora, as if the wilderness around them had taught him a language deeper than speech. When she shifted the reins, he adjusted the wagon's balance. When the wind grew sharp, he laid her coat across the bench before she reached for it. There was no need to explain or request. They had begun to listen in ways most people never did. The land stretched wide around them, craggy slopes fading into slow, curling hills dotted with dry brush and the occasional stunted pine. It wasn't beautiful by any painter's measure, but to Nora it felt honest. It reminded her of people like them, worn, quiet, not soft, but still standing. By the second night she realized he hadn't once let the fire go out. They camped by a dry creek bed where some forgotten traveler had left the stones stacked like a cairn. As the last light faded, Nora gathered what little they had, jerky a bit of stale bread, 2 flasks of water. When she turned around, Ronan had already built a small cooking pit, the flame tight and efficient. It startled her how quickly he moved, how seamlessly he fit into the needs of survival. But what startled her more was that he offered her the better half of the food without hesitation. She took it, nodded, and sat opposite him by the fire. He didn't look directly at her, but she could feel his attention like a tether. That night, as she unpinned her braid beneath the moon, she paused. Her fingers brushed the end and froze. Twine, neatly wrapped. Not the fraying string she'd used days before. She stared at it, something warm blooming in her throat. She hadn't asked for help, hadn't even noticed him behind her. But it was there, a gesture so quiet it almost hurt. The next morning she found the horses fed and the wagon packed before she even stirred. Ronan didn't wait for thanks. He simply checked the wheels with his shoulder braced beneath the axle, testing its weight like a man familiar with the burden of carrying more than his share. By the third evening, they followed a trail that cut through a low valley where cottonwoods whispered overhead and the earth smelled faintly of cedar. Nora pulled the wagon to a halt near a cluster of rocks warmed by the sun. She stepped down slowly, her muscles aching from the road, her breath catching in the cooling air. As she laid out their supplies, she noticed something resting near the ashes of the morning's fire. At first glance, it looked like a piece of bark or a curled branch, but when she lifted it, she realized it had been carved, smoothed by calloused fingers. A hawk, its wings stretched, its head, tilted eyes alert. She turned to find Ronan watching her one knee in the dirt, sharpening a blade with calm precision. "This yours?" she asked, her voice low. He nodded once. For me? Again, the same quiet nod. Then he pointed not at the carving, but at her. She blinked. You think I'm a hawk? He said nothing, but something in the way he watched her, the steadiness, the certainty, made her believe it was more than flattery. That night, she sat beside the fire longer than usual. The stars above them were cold and endless, and the trees around them bent gently as if listening. She reached into her satchel and pulled out the velvet pouch, the one that had carried her ring through war and widowhood, the last piece of a life already gone. She held it in her palm for a long time before tossing it into the fire. The velvet burned fast, curling into ash and smoke. Behind her, Ronan didn't move. He didn't speak, but she knew he had seen. There was no ceremony, no speech, just the sound of flames letting go of something that had held her for far too long. The next morning, the dynamic between them shifted not dramatically, not all at once, but in small, nearly invisible ways. When Nora stumbled over a loose stone while fetching water, Ronan caught her elbow without hesitation. When her shawl snagged on a branch, he untangled it gently. When she stood too long watching the horizon, lost in thought, he returned to the fire with a tin cup of warm broth and placed it beside her knee. He never overstepped, never intruded, but he was always there. And now she realized so was she. She had stopped measuring distance, stopped wondering how far to the next town or how many days left in this strange companionship. She simply existed beside him, step by step, breath by breath. There was something freeing in that, in not needing to explain herself, in not being asked. They spoke through glances, through the crack of kindling, through the slow, deliberate hand movements of daily survival. And in those unsaid things, Nora found a safety she hadn't felt in years. Not since before the war, before death, before silence became her only language. One evening, as dusk painted the sky in bruised lavender, Ronan sat by the fire with a piece of cedar and his blade. He carved without rush, his fingers steady. His brow furrowed not with struggle, but memory. Nora sat nearby, watching the slow reveal of shape and shadow. She didn't ask what it was. When he finished, he set it gently beside her bedroll. It was a wolf, long-legged, lean tail, curved like it had just caught a scent. She stared at it for a long moment. Me? She asked. He shook his head and pointed to himself. She laughed, then not a loud laugh, but a real one. You think you're the wolf? He nodded. Wolves get shot out here, you know, she said. They're called thieves. Killers. He tilted the carving, then pointed to the sky, to the moon rising silver over the trees, to the wind that never stayed in one place. You think the wolf survives, she murmured. He didn't answer, but his eyes did. Later, before she slept, she found another piece of twine tied at the end of her braid. This one was darker, firmer, a quiet reinforcement. She didn't untie it. She touched the hawk carving, the wolf, the fire, and finally her chest. It was not love, not yet, but it was something just as rare. It was the beginning of being known, and she wasn't afraid of it anymore. They reached Mesa Verde just as the sky began to break. Thin clouds shifted like memory across the horizon, and the land rose into wind-carved steps, red and solemn. Ancient stone dwellings clung to the cliffs above them, weathered, quiet, and still holding the breath of lives long gone. Nora pulled the wagon to a slow stop beneath a natural overhang, her hands aching from the reins, her bones heavy with the silence they'd carried across so many miles. Ronan dismounted before she could speak, scanning the rocks as if seeking something hidden. Not danger ritual. He moved like a man who understood sacred spaces and the weight of what had come before. Without words, they set up camp against the stone walls where black soot from old fires still lingered and handprints older than stories stained the sandstone. Nora knelt beside a flat rock and ran her fingers across one faded print, small, delicate, unmistakably human. "They were here," she murmured. "And they left something behind." She didn't expect Ronan to answer, but he paused, glanced at the same wall, and offered the briefest nod. That was all they needed. That night the canyon sang. The wind moved through the cliffs like breath through a flute, soft, hollow, sacred. And with it came dreams. Nora stirred in her sleep fingers, curling against her blanket, her breath catching in a memory she hadn't meant to revisit. In the dream, rain fell without end. A cradle rocked, and silence followed the heavy, irreversible kind. When she woke, her skin was cold with sweat. The fire had burned low, casting long, trembling shadows. She sat up slowly, brushing the sleep from her eyes, and turned toward Ronan. He was still awake. Sitting with his back against the wall, knees drawn up, carving knife in hand, but still. "I lost a child," she said into the quiet. The admission startled even her. But it didn't break. Before the war, before the telegram, before I learned how to live alone. She didn't cry. She had done that long ago. What remained was older than grief. It was what came after the echo of the life she'd planned, the shape of a cradle in an empty room. Ronan didn't speak, but he shifted, moved closer to the fire. Then slowly, he picked up a stick and dragged it through the sand. First, he drew a small house, simple square, with smoke curling from its chimney. Then fire, then a body, then a child, small and crouched beside the flames. She watched, unmoving. Her throat tightened. "Your family," she whispered. He didn't nod, didn't need to. Instead, he added one last line, a clean slash across the home, bisecting it. "Gone." She reached toward him, not to touch, but to place her hand in the dirt beside his. Close enough to say, "I see you. I won't ask for more than you can give." The fire cracked between them, and the ancient walls around them stood witness. Two broken lives sitting side by side, bound not by explanation, but by recognition. She slept again, and when she woke the next morning, the world had stilled. The storm clouds had lifted. Her fever was gone. A wool pelt she didn't recognize was wrapped around her shoulders, tucked tight. And beside her, resting against her pack, was a bead. It was carved from cedar, smooth, warm to the touch despite the cool morning air. A single flame etched into its surface, curved as if flickering in motion. She didn't ask what it meant. She knew. That day, as they packed the wagon in silence, she tied the flame bead into the base of her braid. The twine held firm. The knot didn't slip. They resumed their journey, the trail narrowing as they left the sacred cliffs behind. The trees returned thinner now, as if the land itself was holding its breath. They crossed a river on foot, boots soaked, hands muddy, but neither of them complained. That night, they camped beside a cluster of boulders shaped by wind and time into smooth, stoic giants. The fire burned low again, and Nora sat across from him, her knees drawn up, hair falling over her shoulder. He was whittling something, though the shadows hid the shape. "Ronan," she said softly. He looked up. "That's your name." "The one you left by the fire when I was sick." A pause, then a nod. "It's a good name," she said. "It feels like something that stood through the storm." He said nothing, but his shoulders relaxed as if something had settled inside him, something long restless. "Mine's still Nora," she added with a faint smile. "But I suppose we all carry more names than we speak." Ronan looked at her then, really looked. She could see the canyon in his eyes, the way it held pain, but didn't collapse. The way it bore witness without turning to ash. He reached down, picked up a piece of bark, and began carving again. Later, he handed it to her. It was simple. A woman sitting cross-legged, a braid down her back. Not perfect, not fine, but unmistakable. "You remember, with your hands," she said, tracing the lines of the carving. He nodded, then reached for another piece of wood. He hadn't even looked at the second when he began carving it. His own form hunched beside her open palms, resting on the earth. "You're making both of us," she whispered. He didn't answer, but his hands didn't tremble. That night before sleep took her, she found her braid had been retied again, tighter now, cleaner. Beneath the flame bead hung a new one, carved from darker wood. A ring etched around its edge. No symbol, no initials, just a circle. When she held it in her palm, it fit like something meant to be kept, not claimed. She didn't know what to call what they were building between them. It wasn't a romance, not in the way others told it. There were no flowers, no declarations, just fire, food, gesture, memory, a slow reclaiming of dignity, of voice, of self. And as the fire crackled low and the carvings rested between them, Nora understood something for the first time. He wasn't healing her. She wasn't healing him. They were simply giving each other the space to be whole without ever asking for pieces in return. Durango emerged from the dust like a town that wanted to forget it ever belonged to the wild. Paved walkways ran between storefronts with painted glass. The buildings were taller here, newer, with tin signs that clanged in the wind, and advertisements boasting soap law and virtue. Yet beneath the surface, beneath the perfume and politeness, Nora sensed something old and watching. Judgment wore cleaner boots here, but it still tracked you through town. She tugged her shawl tighter around her shoulders, keeping her braid tucked beneath the folds. She hadn't hidden it in days, but in Durango she could feel the weight of eyes. They didn't spit or jeer like the people in Silverton, but they whispered. Whispering could be worse. Ronan walked beside the wagon, never behind it. His presence drew attention. His silence, his size, the way he carried nothing but a knife and a satchel slung low. He didn't speak, but he didn't cower either. When children pointed and mothers pulled them close, he kept his gaze steady like someone who had already stood trial by fire and didn't intend to plead again. They stopped at the general store for supplies, flour salt, coffee, a small tin of honey she let herself reach for without apology. Inside the store, clerk squinted at Ronan over his spectacles, then turned to her with a practiced half-smile. "You sure you're safe with him?" he asked lightly, voice oily with suspicion wrapped in humor. "I'm safer than I ever was with most," Nora answered, her voice flat. The clerk blinked, said nothing more. Outside, as Ronan tied the flour sack to the back of the wagon, a man across the street stepped forward. He was older, sun-leathered, but his eyes sparked with recognition. "I know you," he said, slowly pointing toward Ronan. "You were at Bent's Fort. Army scout, went missing during that Comanche raid. They said you were dead." Ronan stilled. His hand paused mid-knot. Nora turned sharply. "You're mistaken," she said, stepping between them. "He belongs to no one's past anymore." The man frowned, but something in her voice cut through his curiosity. He stepped back without a fight. They didn't linger. As they passed the church square, Nora could feel the shift. People turned toward them, whispers trailing like smoke. She could almost hear the questions. What's a woman like her doing with a man like that? Is he dangerous? Is she mad? By the time they reached the edge of town, the tension wrapped tight around her spine. She stopped the wagon beside the old well, climbed down, and stepped into the town square. Ronan watched from the shadows, his posture still as carved stone. She didn't raise her voice, didn't make a speech. She simply turned to the people who had gathered like wind-blown leaves and said, "I gave up a ring for a man. Not because I lost my mind, because I found something worth more than memory. I don't need your blessing, and he doesn't need your forgiveness. A few mouths dropped open. A few looked away. But no one spoke. And Nora counted that as victory. They left Durango with the weight of unspoken history trailing behind them like dust. That night, they camped along the ridge where wild sage grew in tufts between the rocks, and the stars felt closer than they should. Ronan sat by the fire carving again. She watched his fingers move slow, deliberate, more confident than before. Not the hands of a ghost, but a craftsman shaping something he could never say out loud. When she turned in for the night, she found a new bead woven into her braid, thinner than the others, warm with the day's sun, etched with a rising sun. She didn't ask what it meant. She already knew. It meant he'd heard every word in Durango. It meant he hadn't left. Even when his past walked up to him in broad daylight and tried to name him again, he hadn't run. He hadn't turned away. He had simply stayed. The next morning, Nora ran her fingers over the bead before she tied her shawl. "You didn't answer that man," she said softly. "Did he tell the truth?" Ronan sat by the fire, stirring embers back to life. He didn't speak. But then slowly, he reached into his pouch and pulled out a strip of canvas. Unfolding it, he revealed an old insignia, tarnished, torn, but unmistakable. A scout's badge, U.S. Cavalry. He didn't offer it. He didn't explain. He just placed it gently into the fire. The flames took it quietly. No ceremony, no spectacle. Just one more thing that didn't need to follow them forward. Nora didn't ask for more. Instead, she said, "You can be Ronan, or whoever you need to be." He looked at her long, slow, with the kind of gaze that didn't just see her, but recognized her. Not as something to be claimed, but as something equal. Solid. That day, they didn't speak. But everything between them had changed. Not in the way people imagine love blooms in sudden bursts of confession or passion. No, this was deeper. This was quieter. This was the kind of trust that came from surviving each other's silence and choosing again and again to remain close. As they crossed into the highland path, Nora leaned into the wind and let it take the last of the town's stares from her skin. Ronan walked ahead of the wagon, hand-steady eyes scanning the ridge. She watched the way he moved now, not as a man hunted or hiding, but as one who had reclaimed his right to walk in the open. And for the first time, she didn't feel like she was defending him. She felt like she was walking beside someone whose strength was finally his own. And maybe, just maybe hers too. The trail narrowed as they reached the high pass where the land forgot to be forgiving. The air thinned, pressing against their ribs like old grief. Beyond the next bend, Nora knew was the homestead her husband had claimed with ink and hope before war took both from him. She had never made it this far with him. She had barely made it this far on her own. But now, with Ronan walking just ahead, she no longer felt like a woman finishing someone else's journey. She felt like someone beginning her own. The cabin stood just as it had in her memory, only more broken. 2 walls remained upright. The rest leaned like tired soldiers, their bones exposed to the wind. Wildflowers pushed up through the rotted floorboards, stubborn and soft. A rusted hinge hung from a door that no longer guarded anything. But there was water, and land, and enough silence to begin again. She stepped down from the wagon without waiting for Ronan. The wind caught the edge of her skirt. Her boots met the earth like she belonged to it. This was supposed to be his home, she said aloud almost to the wind. But I think it was always waiting for someone else. She turned, expecting Ronan to linger by the horses or the wagon. But he was already moving, sleeves rolled, scanning the ground like a man who saw potential where others saw ruin. He walked the perimeter, tested the soil with his hands, studied the angle of the sun. Then he knelt near the frame of the cabin and began digging, bare hands, steady pace, no need for permission. She watched him for a long moment, then joined him. They didn't speak about what they were building, but each motion held meaning. She repaired the front step while he reset the support beams. He rebuilt the fire pit using stones from the ridge, and she dug a shallow bed for herbs beside the creek. At night, they sat on a bench he crafted from salvaged timber, her legs tucked beneath her, his knife always moving in quiet circles through wood. It wasn't a house yet, but it was already a home. One evening, the wind calmed early. The sky softened to that dusty lilac that made her breath catch. Solène, he had stopped being Ronan now, though neither of them said it, sat near the edge of the porch, carving something she couldn't see. The fire cracked low. Nora rested her chin on her knees, braid falling forward over her shoulder. He finished the carving and turned to her, placing something in her hand. It was a hand. Hers, carved into cedar. Palm-up fingers open as if offering something invisible. She didn't speak for a long time, just held it like it was made of glass. When she looked up, he was still watching her. Not intensely, just fully. "What is this?" she asked, her voice thin. He didn't answer. Instead, he reached out and gently turned her wrist, placed the wooden carving in her palm, as if it belonged there, and closed her fingers over it. A mirror of what he had seen, of who she had become. She leaned into him, then not because she needed comfort, but because she had stopped needing to stand alone. Later, in the stillness, she caught sight of herself in the warped mirror they'd found beneath a pile of old boards. Her braid was longer now, heavier. 5 beads hung at its base, bone flame ring bark with his name, and a smooth river stone he had tied without saying a word. She hadn't asked what it meant. She would eventually, but not yet. The next morning, he rose before her as always. She found a note nailed to the edge of the porch. Not fancy, just ink on scrap. "Gone to hunt, back before dusk, don't wait to live." She laughed softly, brushing her thumb across the writing. His first words on paper. And the first time she realized he would come back, not because he was bound, but because he wanted to. That afternoon, barefoot and alone for the first time in weeks, she walked the edge of the creek. The wildflowers bent toward the sun. Her braid swung behind her, the beads clicking softly like chimes. She remembered the cage, the laughter in Silverton, the ring. She remembered the silence that had followed and the way it had changed, not from something empty into something shared. He had never kissed her, never claimed her. But she had been named all the same. Each bead told part of their story, grief, memory, choice, identity, presence. Not a love story in the old sense, but something truer. Something built slowly, not spoken loudly. Something chosen each morning without fanfare. At twilight, she heard the wagon wheels returning. She turned and saw him leading the horse, 2 rabbits slung over his shoulder. He looked up, caught her eye, and nodded once. That was all. She didn't need more. That night, she sat behind him and unwound her braid herself. For the first time, slowly, carefully. She smoothed each bead with her fingers, then retied it, not because she wanted to keep him close, but because she wanted to carry what they'd built. When she was done, she added one more small, carved from bark, the name he had chosen for himself, etched in her own hand. Solon, Earth, Light. Not a name she gave him, but one she now carried as her own kind of vow. In the morning, they began rebuilding the cabin in earnest. She held beams steady while he nailed them. He carved a hawk into the ridgepole just above the door. Her idea, his hands. And when the new walls rose, when the roof stood again, when the hearth was rebuilt from stone they'd carried together, they didn't christen it with wine or prayer. They simply stood in the doorway and exhaled. Not endings, but beginnings. Together. Not because they had nowhere else to go, but because they had chosen this place, this life, this silence woven with meaning. because for the first time they were no longer defined by what had been taken. They were defined by what they had created together, and neither needed a ring to prove it. Some stories end with a kiss, others with a funeral. But the story of Nora Whitfield and the man once called Ghost now, Solon, ends differently. It ends in a silence that's not empty but full. It ends with a braid, not a ring. And if we're listening closely, it offers more than a tale, it offers a truth. There is something deeply human about what we witnessed through these two souls. At its core, this story was never about rescue. It wasn't about a widow saving a caged man, nor about a stranger fixing a broken woman. It was about what happens when two people, each scarred, each silent, each carrying losses that no one else could see, choose to stay, to show up, to sit beside the fire even when they have no words left, to tie a piece of twine into someone's hair and say without speaking, "I see you." Too often in life we search for healing in grand gestures. We wait for someone to declare love with fireworks or sweep us off our feet with perfect lines. But in reality, most healing happens in the quiet. It happens in the moments when someone brings you water without being asked, when someone watches over your sleep, when they carve your likeness into wood not because they need to, but because they've memorized you without trying. That's what Nora found. That's what Solon gave. And that's why we remember them now. This story reminds us that dignity is not restored through pity, it's restored through partnership. Solon never once asked for salvation, and Nora never tried to fix him. She simply opened a door, and he walked through it not as a man bound to her, but as a man choosing to remain by her side. Together they built something greater than survival. They built home not a structure of walls, but a shared rhythm of care. And in a world that often tells us our worth is defined by what we own, who we impress, or how loud we speak, this story dares to offer a different definition that love is not loud, that strength is not forceful, that freedom is not just the absence of chains, but the presence of choice. Nora gave up her wedding ring, something she once swore she'd never part with. Not for money, not for closure, but because she knew that some vows, some loves are meant to end so something new can begin. And what she gained in return was not a man. It wasn't even a companion in the traditional sense. What she gained was a mirror, someone who saw her grief without fear, who honored her space without retreating from it, who added to her story without trying to erase the pages that came before. And Solon, he too made a choice. He could have run, could have disappeared back into the shadows like a ghost. But he didn't. He picked up nails and built a porch. He carved her hand and tied her braid. He wrote nothing on paper except the word home. In doing so, he rewrote what love could look like. For all of us. So, what can we take from their story? Maybe this? We don't have to be whole to be worthy. We don't have to speak perfectly to be heard. We don't have to be healed to be held. We can begin again, whether we're 27 or 67, whether we've buried a spouse or buried our voice, whether we come from cages made of iron or cages made of regret. The key is not always to escape. Sometimes the key is to let someone braid you back together one act of kindness at a time. And sometimes the most radical thing we can do in this world of noise and demand is to sit quietly beside someone, listen, and choose to stay. Solon didn't save Nora. Nora didn't rescue Solon. They simply chose to walk forward together, slowly, silently, and with great care. So, to anyone who has ever felt unseen, unheard, unchosen, this story is for you. To the ones who've lost love and thought it would never return. To the ones who've been caged by judgment, by grief, by silence. To the ones who wonder if they're too broken, too late, too strange. Let this be your reminder. It is never too late to build something beautiful from what remains. You don't need a vow. You don't need permission. You just need one thread of courage, one moment of stillness, and perhaps someone willing to braid a story beside yours. Because sometimes a braid can hold more than hair. It can hold memory. It can hold trust. It can hold home. And if you've made it this far with us, if you've felt something stir inside as Nora and Solon rebuilt a life from silence and ash, then please know their story doesn't end here. There are more stories like this, hidden in the dust of forgotten towns, tucked behind weathered doors and old journals, waiting to be told. And with your support, we can keep telling them. If this story moved you, if it whispered something true into the quiet parts of your heart, then we invite you to subscribe to our channel. Like, share, and leave a comment below. Tell us what part of Nora and Solon's journey spoke to you most. Did you feel seen? Did you remember someone? Did you feel, maybe for the first time in a long time, understood? Your voice matters, and your presence helps us keep going. Because here at Echoes of the West, we don't just tell stories. We pass down reminders of who we are, who we've loved, and who we still have a chance to become. So subscribe, stay a while, and when the next story arrives, we'll be here, waiting beside the fire, ready to braid something new.